Hello, welcome back. This is part 2 of the Bell trial. I'm going to jump straight back into this and assume that you've just finished watching part 1. So the comparator was 12 weeks of usual activity, and this occurred immediately preceding the training intervention. The primary outcome of the study was grip strength, which is recommended in routine clinical practice. And what that means is that the study was powered to reliably detect a between group difference. So the difference between grip strength measured at the start of the trial versus the end of the intervention period. The kettlebells there are showing 16 and 27 kilos, which are the cutoff for sarcopenia, the cutoff measures, the threshold for sarcopenia. In clinical practice, if somebody came in and had an upper limb issue, I would often ask them to pick up a weight, and it was interesting having conversations with people about kettlebells, and I would often just liken it to a handbag or a shopping bag. It's just a weight with a handle. Obviously the cylindrical grip of a kettlebell is similar to the isometric JAMA dynamometer that we're looking at here. The difference is that with the kettlebell you can use a hook grip and typically hold onto a weight that's much heavier than the grip strength indicates. The reason for that is that we're using the heel of our hand, or the hypothenar eminence here, as a brace against which we squeeze with our fingers. So that's why there's typically a difference between our grip strength as measured by a dynamometer like this one and what we might be able to lift or pick up in a gym. So a modified Southampton protocol, what that meant was that the participants were sat down in a seat with their elbow resting on the arm of a chair at 90 degrees with their wrist hanging off the end. I would support their wrist underneath the dynamometer, and then they would squeeze as hard as they could. They did that 3 times, and we took the highest of the 3 measures. The secondary outcomes, and there were lots of them, were based around measures of health-related physical fitness, that being aerobic capacity, muscular strength and power, muscular endurance, flexibility, body composition, and functional capacity and balance. Now, whilst there were between group difference changes in some of these measures, I'd just like to highlight that these were exploratory for hypothesis generation. The study wasn't appropriately powered to reliably report a between group difference. So we need to be cautious in our interpretation of findings for these secondary outcomes. Now, where this had come from was this particular paper, which was looking at clinical field tests used in physiotherapy. And this underscores the pragmatic nature of the intervention or the study, which was intended to inform practitioners and be relevant to people in clinical practice and the participants involved in the study. For aerobic capacity, I used the 6-minute walk test, which is quite common, and a stair climb. And from the stair climb, I was able to estimate a VO2 max. Just to explain the stair climb, it was 5 floors inside the health sciences building that we saw in part 1. And the participants were asked to get up the staircase as fast as they could without running and without holding on to the railings. It took roughly about 40 seconds and involved a vertical ascent of roughly 13.5 meters, so it was quite challenging. The muscular strength and power measures, there were several of these. First off, isometric knee and hip extension. And I also need to give a hat tip back to PT Increst again. This particular episode gave me both the measures or reference data for knee extensor to body weight torque in an older population, and also the angle at which the knee needed to be to generate the most force. So you can see this lady sitting on a box that I had built. My father-in-law built this for me, and this yellow piece of wood is fixing the knee in 60 degrees of flexion. The reason for this particular device is that I wanted to reduce the potential for cheating, and quite often in in studies they'll use a seat where there's a cushion, and so I wanted to limit that so it had a hard base, no back and no armrest, so that they couldn't hold on and use their torso and trunk as leverage. So thanks again to PT Inquest. I also used a sit to stand app, which gave me relative lower limb power, and then we went back into the lab again onto the force plate to measure vertical jump height, which gave us a measure of absolute lower limb power. Muscular endurance, we used the 30-second sit to stand test, which is very common in an older population. And for flexibility, initially I started with the fingertip to floor measure, but I was feeling a little bit hesitant about that because I was aware that it was difficult, near impossible, to prevent people bending their knees. So in the second round of testing, I also included the sit and reach test so that they were using both measures, and my intention being to compare between the two. For body composition, I used DEXA, dual X-ray absorbed geometry, which is the gold standard, but I also used bioelectrical impedance analysis, or BIA. And the reason for that is that I, at my practice, had been using BIA. It was basically a set of home scales with a handheld device. You could get the same data, and those scales were only a few $100s. So in clinical practice, somebody can record BIA data, but they aren't going to have a DEXA machine. So I wanted to be able to compare the body composition data between the two machines and see how reliable the BIA was. For functional capacity and balance, I used a few different measures. First off is the 5 times floor transfer, which was timed. I talked about this in part 1. The reason for doing 5 of these rather than 1 was that the participants were generally healthy and were able to get up off the floor independently, so there was likely to be a ceiling effect, which means that had I only timed 1 repetition, the chances of us detecting a significant reduction in time to complete that was likely small. So by asking them to do that 5 times, that introduces a component of fatigue in that, and if you like to give that a go, it's actually more challenging than it sounds. The second part was the 1RM deadlift, so this is just lifting a weight up off the floor. When I first met the participants, I asked them to complete a deadlift ladder in the lab, and they stopped at the weight that they felt that they couldn't go beyond or didn't want to go beyond. The MyLift app, which I used, uses a lightweight, so it typically started around a 10 or 12 kilo bell, and then something that was roughly 80–85% of their 1RM, which I had a reasonable estimation of, having seen them actually lift, and then this gave us a reasonably reliable estimated 1RM. And then finally, quiet standing balance, eyes open, eyes closed. So what this does on a force platform is measures the amount of excursion as you're standing still, and that's what the red lines are. Theoretically, the more balanced you are, the less the excursion there will be, and theoretically that would be associated with falls risk. Quality of life measures, I used the SF-36 and Antonovsky's sense of coherence scale. I also recorded attendance and compliance, so that's attendance in the Monday, Wednesday, Friday classes and compliance with the home training. And training load, I recorded internal and external training load volume, so kilos for external and arbitrary units, which is the session RPE multiplied by the session duration, which gives us the arbitrary unit value. And I also recorded adverse events as well. This shows the 9-month timeline from the middle of August 2019 through till the end of May 2020, which was when the final testing was completed. And I'll go through this in a little bit more detail. So as I mentioned in part 1, Recruitment started at the end of August 2019, and that was complete by the middle of September. In October 2019, all of the participants came into the lab and I collected the swing data, which we looked at in part 1. And then in the first week of November, baseline data was collected just before the beginning of the control period. So the control period ran for 12 weeks. In January, the beginning of January, I took the group of the over 70s through a pilot week just to get a sense of where they were at. And then in February, the whole group went through a familiarization week prior to testing. And then the training commenced in earnest on the 10th of February. Now, this is where COVID hit us. The fourth round of testing was due to happen in April, but things got shifted forward. So the next round of testing, which was abbreviated, happened on the 20th of March. And then quite by coincidence, those of you that follow Adam Meakins may recall that he had a 100 swings a day challenge that he was running through May. Now, because of COVID, ethics didn't give me clearance to conduct my 5th round of testing as scheduled, which meant that there was potentially a month where the participants weren't going to be training at all, and I didn't want them to lose any potential gains that they might have had. So everybody in the group volunteered to sign up to this 100 swings a day for the rest of May, which worked out really well. So not only did they do that, but it gave me an extra month of the participants doing something to hopefully maintain any gains that they might have got. And then the final testing was conducted on the 27th, 28th of May, and in that period I'd also conducted the interviews for the qualitative study. So it worked out reasonably well. I've also uploaded with the trial data a consort checklist and a conserve consort checklist, which is used to identify changes that were made specifically due to COVID. I've also included a PRECIS-2 assessment with the trial. The indicator wheel at the bottom here shows different domains with a score 0 through to 5. And what this is supposed to show is how representative of usual practice the intervention is, or as I mentioned, external validity. You can see where I lost marks, so to speak, was on the recruitment and setting. So to get maximum marks, the study would have been conducted in an existing community-based setting and not had to actively recruit people into a study. So unfortunately, that's just the nature of the research that I had to do. Now on to the results, the bit that most people are interested in. This very busy table is reported as table 2 in the manuscript. I'm going to stay on this one for a moment and explain what we're looking at. So each of the rows represents all of the outcome measures. So everything that was recorded has been reported, and it shows the difference between baseline and different time points, week 13, week 19 and week 29. Now, as you'll see from the second column down, the 6-minute walk distance, there was a statistically significant difference between baseline and 13 weeks. So what this data is including is any change that occurred during the control period, not which occurred only as a result of the training intervention, which is what we are most interested in. So I'm going to come back to that in a moment. And the second point here is week 19. You'll see that a lot of those fields are blank. That was the March 20 date that had to be brought forward, so testing round 4. Now each of the testing rounds involved at least 6, if not 7 people working together over 2 days and 10 hours to collect all of the data. And because of COVID and there needing to be a very hurried collection of data, I had to do this in a scheduled training session, so a 40-minute block instead of a 10-hour block, which is why there's so few outcome measures. There's 3 on the next page, And because of close contact restrictions, some of these tests I simply wasn't able to get close enough to people for long enough to be able to collect the data. But I've got everything for week 29, so although it would have been nice to have it, unfortunately I didn't have it. Now, this is the table that people are most interested in. This is reported as table 3 in the paper. And what this shows is each of the outcomes where there was a statistically significant change pre to post training only. So this is eliminating anything that may have changed during the control period. And in several instances it did. What I've done is report the mean difference, the confidence interval, the effect size, and the percentage change, because I recognize that people will want to see data reported differently because they use the data differently. And before I move on and we look at each of these in more detail, because statistically significant doesn't necessarily mean clinically significant, I'm just going to highlight the Cohen's effect size that I used. Now, there's a paper by Rhea that is specific to resistance training, and it accounts for training age of the participants as well, and that affects the effect size descriptor. So an effect size typically of 0.8 would be described as large. In this, it would be only moderate. So we have to have a larger change in the measure to use the similar descriptor that most people would associate with the Cohen's d. So just bear that in mind when we're looking at these figures. Now, this first one is the grip strength. This is the one that the primary outcome, which was confirmatory. I'm just going to show you this video of one of the trial participants because it's highly entertaining. I can't do it.
Did it!
Ripping an apple in two with her bare hands. Now, to be fair, I think she could do this before the trial. So as you can see, the mean difference in the right and left hands, which were effectively the same as the dominant and non-dominant hand. I think in retrospect, I would have probably reported it as dominant and non-dominant had I thought about it a little bit further, was 7.1 and 6.3 kilograms. And to give you a little bit of perspective, 1.6 kilos is regarded as a real change, but 5 kilos is a clinically important difference. This meta-analysis from 2019 included 24 different trials, the largest of which was a 3 kilo difference. So the Bell trial far exceeded all of those studies, which are comparable resistance training or intervention specifically intended to improve grip strength. And that paper that did have the 3 kilo difference was using pool noodles, just to give you an illustration of what's typically given to older adults. There was a significant reduction of almost 3 seconds in the stair climb time, but on its own, it's not particularly meaningful, and the effect size, as you can see, is not particularly large. But what we can do is estimate a change in VO2 max from that. However, as you can see, the difference there was roughly 2.5 milliliters per kilo per minute, which is half of what would be typically considered a clinically important difference. So whilst it changed, it probably wasn't particularly meaningful. The 5 times floor transfer did have a moderate reduction in get up time of 6 seconds. Visually, the difference was huge. For me, as I mentioned in part 1, this was the one test that was of most interest and meaningful to me, and visually watching people get up off the ground, there was a significant difference, noticeable difference in how quickly and efficiently they got off the floor. So that was great, even though the effect size was only moderate. The mean difference in the 6-minute walk distance was a little over 40 meters. Now, whilst the effect size is moderate, the minimum clinically important difference for an otherwise healthy older adult is closer to 50 meters, or likely to be closer to 50 meters. Now, whilst there were some individuals that did get over 50, and I think the highest was 92, on average, it didn't quite reach a minimum clinically important difference. The sit to stand, however, the minimum clinically important difference is between 2 and 3 reps, and we had 3.3. So that was definitely an encouraging outcome change. The predicted 1RM, I haven't been able to identify what's considered a minimum clinically important difference. That was roughly 16 kilos, which is not quite as high as I was anticipating, but given that the participants didn't have access to any heavy weights from week 6 onwards, that's not at all surprising. The knee extension force was only statistically significant in one leg and not the other. I've included both of these obviously because it wouldn't make sense to report only one limb, and the reader can make their own interpretation of the data. As you can see from this, the effect size, even though one was clinically significant and the other wasn't, the effect size wasn't actually that much different. There is a question mark over the reliability of the data, given that the confidence interval was quite large, and I've discussed that in the paper. And something similar for the hip extension as well. It was only a small change and only statistically significant in one limb. Whether there is a minimum clinically important difference threshold for both of those, I'm not sure, given that those measures typically decrease with age. I think maintaining them is good. The fact that they've gone up is also good, or encouraging at least. Now, there was a small statistically significant change in the SF36, but if we look at it in a little bit more detail, we can see that that change came from only one of the 8 domains. There was no significant change in the other 7, and given that this all occurred in the midst of COVID, I have no confidence whatsoever in suggesting that kettlebell training improved the SF36 scores. There was a small statistically significant improvement in lean muscle mass of 0.65 kilos. Now that's unsurprising given that the trial participants didn't have access to any of the heavier weights after week 6. But it's also encouraging in 2 regards. One, the fact it's gone up rather than simply being maintained, and 2, that it was twice the size of the effect reported in the Chen paper, which was the 8-week kettlebell training intervention with older adults with sarcopenia that I mentioned in part 1. But whether this has reached or surpassed a threshold for being clinically important, I'm uncertain. As far as I can gather, a minimum clinically important difference seems to be closer to 0.75 of a kilo. So if anybody has any data on that, please let me know. And because of that, the corresponding sarcopenia index has also gone up. This slide shows the training load over the 12-week period, both the external and internal. So that's kilos lifted or moved, and the arbitrary units, which was the session rating of perceived exertion multiplied by the duration. Now, you may recall from part 1 that my intention with the trial was to progressively load or progressively increase intensity and volume throughout the training period, so over the 12 weeks. What I didn't do was actually program that. So it was a very iterative process of me seeing what the participants were doing and getting feedback from them as to what they liked and what they were struggling with and so on. And as you'll see in later slides, there was a very intentional periodization on a weekly microcycle basis for that very reason. But what was most surprising about this was how linear this had been, given that it wasn't programmed like that, and 2, that the training load more than doubled in the second half of the intervention, given that they were training at home and didn't have access to any of the heavy weights. So it's absolutely fascinating to see that training load outcome. This slide shows you what the participants did in the final week of the training. So each of those rows 1 to 24 shows you the participants. Now this was the only time in 12 weeks where I programmed for them a target training load on the Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and this was done very intentionally because I wanted to, for motivation purposes, to set them a training load where they would hit the last day and hit a PB on the final day. Now, because of the training at home challenge, the heaviest training or the largest training load volume that the group had attained was on the final day in the gym at the end of week 6. So I had that data, and I had the 5 weeks of training at home, and what I did was take the average, whatever their average was for the previous 5 weeks up to the end of week 11, added 30% to that, and then that was their Monday target, and I think I added another 30% to the Wednesday, and the same with the Friday, with a little bit of fluctuation based on individuals. And everybody hit their training load, which was amazing. But what they actually did was way surpass that. So here are the actuals, and this is how far some of them exceeded that. I think the largest was almost double, which 192%. There are a couple of people that just got in, which was perfect, 102, 103%, even one at 101. But looking at the individuals in here, and I reported a lot of this at the time via Facebook posts, was absolutely fascinating. There were some amazing stories in here, people that had way surpassed their target. One participant who was immunocompromised and feeling horribly unwell, I think she had 170% from memory, just absolutely smashed her target. And to give you an indication, there was one huge outlier right in the middle here, row 14. On the final day, I set him a target of 31,000 kilos, and he hit 56,000 kilos. On that last day, you can see he did 21,120. Now, I had told the participants in the early days or earlier that I had previously at my practice hit 20,000 kilos in a 40-minute training session. I said, I'm going to do this again. So on that final week, and given that they were all fairly familiar with calculating and reporting their volume and the concept of adding volumes based on sets and reps, they each had 3 bells at home. I'd given them a target and said, you do whatever exercises you're comfortable with that enable you to lift the most weight in the shortest amount of time, and that's what we're going to do. I was lucky that I had a lot more bells at home, so I set up 5 bells that morning. I knew exactly what I was going to do. I had 9 rounds programmed, and it would give me 20,016 kilos. I woke up that morning, felt bloody awful, and did it anyway. So I set my timer for 45 minutes, got on Facebook Live, and just started to go through it. And it was hard work, and I think by round 7 or 8, I was feeling pretty good. And I thought, you know what, this guy who is a huge outlier, he's going to be trying to beat me. And if I've only set myself 20,016 kilos, I know, I bet my house that he's going to beat it. And sure enough, he was. He was doing the same thing at home, intentionally trying to beat my 20,000 target, and he did. And I managed to sneak in an extra round with 10 seconds to spare. And had I not done that, he would have beaten me by 1,100 kilos. And he's in his 70s. I think he was 70 at the time, 70, 71. Which just goes to show how extraordinary some of these individuals were. And I was pushing myself hard, so I had better access to bells. I'd been doing it a long time. It was not unusual to me, and this 70-year-old guy was hot at my heels throughout the whole thing. It was absolutely amazing. So it was just such a fantastic outcome to see that. Adherence to the Monday, Wednesday, Friday sessions was very high, 91.5%, with 8 of the participants completing all of them. The reasons for missing sessions was nothing unusual or unexpected. And also the compliance with the Tuesday-Thursday sessions was also very high at 88.7%. And interestingly, in the second half, when I was collecting responses via SurveyMonkey, there were 35 instances where somebody had recorded a weekend training session in addition to the Monday to Friday sessions that they were also doing. And moving on to the qualitative study. Now, the intention of this project was to see whether this style intervention was something that we could recommend other community-based providers offer to the public. So I had this very specific question: was engagement sufficiently high and positive to warrant a recommendation that group-based kettlebell training initiatives be used to promote healthy aging in the community? Because if the outcomes had improved, let's say there was a 7 kilo difference in grip strength, that's all good and well, but if the participants had said, hey, you know what, Neil, I hate kettlebells, I haven't enjoyed this at all, I'm never going to touch one ever again, then it would be ineffective in the real world. So that's why we conducted this qualitative study. Now, the participants in the second half of the trial had become very comfortable using SurveyMonkey because that's how they were reporting their training data. So what I did in developing the interview questions was compile a series of quantitative rating scale questionnaires. So I put the questionnaires together, sent them out via SurveyMonkey, and collected a whole load of data. And there were 3 main ones. One was their kettlebell experience, and this included almost 60 different items, everything from what had been their motivation for wanting to do it, because it had been a surprise to me that there were 150 older adults in the community that wanted to do kettlebell training, through to the things that they had enjoyed and noticing changes in their physical capacity or function. And then 2 others, one specifically addressing the positive and beneficial effects, and the next one addressing the negative and undesirable effects. And I wanted to highlight both sides of the coin. So I collected all of that data, and that enabled me to formulate the questions as an interview guide. Now, I at that point had established a good relationship with the participants. I'd been working with them for 6 months plus and spent a lot of time with them. And so this was a framework. What the SurveyMonkey responses had enabled me to do was to collate specific responses, and some of them were open-ended questions from individuals about their experience, and in the conversation I had with them, explore specific responses to certain topics to get as much feedback from the participants as I could. So I conducted the 28 interviews. That was everybody that started bar 1. The only person excluded was a gentleman that had to withdraw in the second week due to work commitments. So he just hadn't really been involved long enough to provide what I felt was going to be meaningful data. And then I had audio transcripts, and they were transcribed. I went through and tidied those up because they're never perfect, and thematically coded them. And we came up with 4 overarching themes. 1, enjoying the physical and psychosocial benefits. 2, change in a long-term health condition. This was particularly important given the range of health conditions that we saw in part 1. Things like knee arthritis and back pain and not sleeping well. There's a whole list of things which had significantly improved, and it was great to get that feedback from the participants. Number 3, overcoming challenges. And if you're wanting to have a closer look at the things which would be quote unquote negative, that's where they're described. The reason why it's described as a theme of overcoming challenges is because in every instance that's what the participants did. Whether it was an ache or a pain, whether it was muscle soreness, whether it was XYZ, they always confronted the things that were challenging and overcame them. Hence the theme, overcoming the challenges. And then finally, number 4, feeling part of a group or community, which was fantastic, and mirrors many other studies where the community component and the mixing with other people of a similar age is highly motivating. Along with the paper is a core cue checklist if anybody's particularly interested, so ticking another box. On these next few slides, I've presented the raw data from those questionnaires because there were some really interesting results in here worth having a look at. Back in part 1, I mentioned that I'd had 152 applicants to participate in the trial, which was a real surprise. I wasn't expecting such a large number of people to put their hand up, and I mentioned in my confirmation of candidature that I'd made this pitch that the reasons to do the training and run the training were to encourage people to be more physically active and to keep them independent and living at home and out of hospital. And the two top reasons were to increase physical activity and to maintain independence. So it was really encouraging to see that the reasons for the older adults wanting to participate were exactly the same as my motivations for running the trial to encourage them to be just that. So that was really good to see. Here are the factors that the participants reported as being most influential in their enjoyment of the trial. And I had mixed feelings about this because at the top of the list is the instructor's personality, i.e. me, which makes me feel good. It's nice to have some acknowledgement that what I've done was valued by the participants. But on the flip side, it certainly raises questions about the potential effectiveness of the intervention if it's being delivered by somebody else with different experience and knowledge and different personality. I'm quite an introvert, so perhaps it might even be higher in somebody else. But lots of interesting questions from that one. This slide is showing how well the participants felt that they had performed. This was really important for me to get a gauge as well, because I was pushing them as hard as I felt that I could, and more than 80% of them reported that they had exceeded or far exceeded their expectations in what they felt that they were going to be able to do, which was really, really good. And on this, I had lots of very specific questions, either related to clinical components like balance and falls risk. So there's a question here that says I feel steadier and more balanced on my feet, and questions relating to proposed effects of kettlebell training, such as increased strength, increased cardiovascular capacity, and change in body composition. So I asked very specific questions targeted at those and asked the participants to gauge their awareness of those having changed or not. And at the top of the list, I feel a sense of achievement and I feel less concerned about lifting or manipulating heavy objects. That was really encouraging because I was pushing the participants very hard, and in the conversations I had with them during and after, they typically felt that they had done very well and they enjoyed the fact that they had pushed themselves hard and achieved something. And clinically, we tend to treat older adults as being quite fragile and avoid asking them to lift heavy objects and lift heavy weights, particularly if it's in a clinical / rehab setting. So it was very encouraging to see that their perception of using weights and lifting something heavy changed. And so that was very encouraging to see. Having wrapped up the qualitative study, I then wanted to go back to the swing. And the reason for this was that my experience as an instructor and my knowledge of what was happening in the kettlebell world and the scoping review is that there were lots of claims specifically around the effect of the hard style swing. So it has to be done a particular way, and if you're not doing it a particular way, then that's going to negatively affect the potential improvements that you might get. So to boil it down, the claim is that the hardstyle swing, because of its ballistic in nature, improves lower limb power. So there's a lot of emphasis around technique. What we're looking at here is the 8, 10, 12, 14 and 16 kilo swing peak force, or the net peak force. So I had the under 70-year-old participants come back into the lab and repeat what they had done before the training intervention, because I wanted to see how those measures had changed as a result of 16 weeks of training. The hypothesis was that the force profiles would change. It seemed unreasonable to suggest that 16 weeks of practicing kettlebell training, and on average I think it was around about 3,000 swings per person, it seemed unreasonable to suggest that it wouldn't change. So I had the participants come back in, they repeated the swings, and then I compared the before and after data. Now each of these lines with a little circle at the end of each of them is representing the pre and post training change per individual, and some of them go up, some of them go down, some of them don't really change much, but on average there was no significant difference other than the 8 kilo bell. There was no significant change in the peak force. Now, to compare myself as the quote-unquote expert versus the novices in the original two studies, there was roughly a potential, or seemed to be a potential, for the participants to double the force through the floor and double the rate of force development, or how quickly they were swinging the bells. And the suggestion was that if I improve the swing technique, I can improve the force and I can improve the power, if rate of force development is a proxy for power, without necessarily having to increase the bell weight to therapeutically have an effect on something like knee arthritis. So the first question around force was that unfortunately it didn't change. This component of the swing was swing cadence. Now this, in my experience, is one of the quickest, easiest ways to alter and improve somebody's swing, is having them swing faster. Typically what happens with novices, and as we saw in the force time profile in part 1, was that the novices were lifting the bell, and that tends to slow things down. And as you can see in each of these cases, the 8, 10, 12, 14 and 16, the post-training change shows a significant improvement in swing cadence. So they were swinging faster. Now interestingly, force is a product of mass and acceleration. So theoretically, if the bell's moving faster because they're swinging faster, then I would have expected force to have increased. So it was certainly surprising to see swing cadence increase as much as it did, but without a corresponding increase in force. Component was to then look at the force time curve, because as we saw in part 1, that gives a reasonably good indication as to what's happening swing technique. Now these first two graphs are before and after training in one individual, and you can see there's definitely a change. The second peaks have become a lot more jagged, for want of a better word, and I'm just going to bring my image up as a comparison here, and you can see that the post-training force time profile looks a lot closer to mine, so that was suggestive of an improvement. But here's another one. This was a gentleman whose performance was quite outstanding, but it looks like there is a worsening of the force time profile in this instance. So whilst there were some changes and what appeared to be improvements in places, I would have said on the whole that the force time profiles didn't dramatically improve in a way that I had hoped that they might. Next up was forward force. I talked about this briefly in part 1, I think. In hardstyle training, there's a perception that when we're swinging a bell, a lot of the force is forward, not vertical, or the majority of the force is suggested to be forward. Without going into too much detail, that's not the case. In myself, the average was give or take around about 15% of the vertical force. In the older adults, it was closer to between 5 and 10%. And there wasn't a dramatic improvement in the forward force either, unfortunately. The final piece of the swing puzzle was rate of force development. Now, due to technology and time constraints, I was only able to calculate data from one of the bell weights. I can't say that this was the same in all of the other bells, but it seems quite likely. If rate of force development is a proxy for power, which it seems reasonable to suggest that it is, there didn't seem to be any improvement in power development or lower limb power development based on this data, and that certainly corresponds with the lack of any significant change in relative and absolute lower limb power measured by sit to stand and vertical jump height, because there was no change there. So in terms of swing technique, it was all quite disappointing. I had expected that their swing would improve. I'd expected that there would be an improvement in force. There would be a change in the way that they were swinging based on the force time profile or illustrated by the force time profile, and an improvement in the magnitude of forward force relative to vertical force, because if swing technique improves, then those other measures should do. So the only thing that did improve was cadence, but it didn't seem to have an awful lot of effect elsewhere, unfortunately. Now finally, the next question was about the deadlift. So did the deadlift force change? And yes, is the short answer to that one. There was a significant improvement in the amount of net force through the floor, and that ties in with the increase in not only predicted 1RM, significant improvement of 16 kilos on average, and the qualitative feedback from the participants saying that they felt less concerned about lifting heavier weights and more comfortable. So it may not be that they necessarily got any stronger, it may be that they were just more confident in lifting the weight, and that translated to them standing up quicker with the same weight, which would account for the improvement in force. So they may not necessarily have got dramatically stronger, but the confidence may have accounted for that, which is in itself a great outcome. The final study in the project was this multiple case study involving two individuals, a female and a male, with low bone mineral density and a diagnosis of osteoporosis. Now, I've included these two images just to illustrate the training load volume, the periodized weekly microcycles. Earlier on, we looked at the very linear increase in training load. I've included these because they are representative of what the group was doing. They all looked slightly different, but a clear undulating increase, decrease in load on a daily and weekly basis. And here is that very linear macro cycle. Now, I was aware from the outset that Sally had osteoporosis because she approached me before joining the trial and told me that she had osteoporosis and expressed some concerns whether it was going to be suitable or not. But I didn't know about Peter's diagnosis until just after the training had started. Now, I was lucky to get this data. It was not an outcome of the trial itself. Even though I was using DEXA to record body composition, a bone mineral density scan that uses DEXA is performed differently. So it's the same machine, but it's a different type of scan, and I can't collect BMD data from a body composition scan, unfortunately. But these two individuals had been to their GP, and the GP had referred them for a bone mineral density scan, and so both of them had had a scan immediately before training or very close to commencing training, and then in the weeks after the training had completed. So we had a pretty good look at what had changed either side of the training or not at all. And the next slide will show you in a little bit more detail. Now, based on BMI, we can calculate a least significant change, which is comparable to a minimum clinically important difference. And for both Peter and Sally, the size of increase in bone mineral density at the lumbar spine, which is where we are typically looking at changes in bone mineral density clinically, both of them were twice their least significant change, which is excellent. For Sally, there was also a 12% increase in BMD at the femoral neck and a 2.5% increase for Peter. So very, very encouraging data and quite unusual when compared to other programs. Now, just to illustrate that both Peter and Sally were representative of the group, I've included their grip strength measures, the floor transfer time and the 6-minute walk distance for both of these two individuals to show you. So their attendance was identical, 94.4%. Compliance was fairly similar, around about 90. Sally shifted almost 75,000 kilos, and bearing in mind that's just a Monday, Wednesday, Friday sessions. That's excluding the Tuesday, Thursday sessions. And Sally was the one of the lightest in the group at I think just under 50 kilos body weight. And Peter moved 110,000 kilos. I think the average was closer to 100. And both of these individuals were over 70. So grip strength, 6 and 7 kilos right and left for Sally, and 8 and 8 for Peter. So fairly close to the mean that we saw earlier. The 5 times floor transfer, Peter was pretty close to the average, 2.4. Sally was considerably higher than that, so 9.7 seconds she knocked off, and 63 meters further on the walking distance for her. Now that was really surprising because Sally was a walker. She walked most days and she was quick. So she also increased more than what I had suggested was the minimum clinically important difference of 50. Unfortunately, Peter wasn't able to complete that walk on the final day, so I don't have that data for him. The challenge we have in making this claim that the kettlebell training was the result of the change in bone mineral density is that people might say, but this wasn't a high quality randomized controlled trial with a concealed allocation and blinding. Is this sufficient evidence to establish causation, i.e. did the kettlebell training cause the change in bone mineral density? Well, the answer to that is probably, and there's something called the Bradford Hills Guidelines for Causation, and we're going to look at that right now. Now, in 3 types of evidence required in the Bradford Hills criteria for causation: mechanistic evidence, direct evidence, and parallel evidence. So under mechanistic, we have coherence. So does it cohere with what we expect to see? And is there evidence for the mechanism? Yes and yes. We expect to see that if somebody is involved in resistance training, that it's going to impact their bone mineral density. It's in all of the guidelines for the management of osteoporosis and the promotion of bone health is resistance and impact training. Secondly, under direct evidence, is there dose response, or is there a dose response relationship? Absolutely. We've just seen that Peter shifted 110,000 kilos plus what he was doing on his Tuesday, Thursday sessions, and for Sally 75,000 kilos. So a considerable dose response. Secondly, is the size of the effect greater than any plausible confounders? Yes, even with Peter's medication, that only accounted for up to 50% of his. So again, there was nothing else that would have accounted for that change in bone mineral density. And did they occur around about the same time? Well, yes, because we've got scans either side of the training intervention and a clear change. And finally, under parallel evidence, is there replication and similar data of a similar effect? And again, the answer to that is yes. This particular study was a 12-month intervention with a female that had low bone mineral density, and the effect size was even larger than ours. So we can say with reasonable confidence that the change in bone mineral density was as a result of, an effect of, the kettlebell training. Before I start to wrap things up, I'm just going to touch briefly on the manuscripts that have come from this project and those that could have. Now, just before I jump into this, to give a little bit of background, where I'm at Bond University, typically what happens is students are expected to publish their work in a gold or Q1 open access journal, and there's a cost associated with that. So give or take, for my articles, around about $3,000 here in Australia, and that would usually be paid by the institution. Now, my scoping review, as we've seen, was published, and that was paid for by Bond, and then COVID hit, and because there's a considerable cost associated with this, that was cut back. So I had a budget for my 4-year PhD of $10,000, which is quite a lot, but none of that is typically allocated to publishing costs. And again, as a result of COVID, I didn't allocate or didn't spend that budget on things like travel to conferences and presentations and so on, where it may normally go. And I didn't spend much during the trial on equipment and so on. So I ended up spending over $7,000 on paying for the 2 main trial papers to be published, but that meant that all of the others are still, and will probably continue to be, sitting as preprints only, and most likely won't get published in a journal. So with that in mind, what I had wanted to do was write a critical review. If you've looked at the scoping review, there's a lot of data out there, and there's a lot of publications being cited claiming effects, and there's several systematic reviews, but the quality of those is not fantastic. And I really wanted to write a critical review to give people a better understanding of the reliability and accuracy of the data and the claims that were out there, but unfortunately that didn't happen. As we've seen, the expert profile, when I say expert, that's just me, is available as a preprint. The younger novices, as I said, I had that data, but unfortunately due to time restraints, that didn't make it any further than that, so that unfortunately got axed. The older novices is available as a preprint. The protocol was published to Open Science. I would have loved to have had that published by BMC Geriatrics, but as I mentioned, time was against my side, and other factors which prevented that going any further. So it's there, it's available, it's not as polished as the other papers, so that's a slight disappointment for me. A registered report, I would love to have had a registered report published as well, but as I mentioned, I didn't find out that they even existed until it was too late, unfortunately, but ideally that would have been part of the project. The quantitative study, the main trial paper, is published. The qualitative paper, as we've seen, is published, as is the change in bone mineral density case study, but again only as a preprint. The change in force profile is published, and that's the last of them. And in terms of case studies, there were several really interesting case studies from participants involved in the trial that I would have loved to have written about. One person that had a diagnosis of cancer, and I won't go into any more detail than that, thrived in terms of what he was doing and how well he was performing, and I would love to have written that up as a potential means of engaging people with that diagnosis in regular exercise. Obviously, I'm going to stop there before I dig myself into a hole. The next one, NEOA. I came into this project, as I've touched on a couple of times, with ideas specifically about the effect of, or potential effect of, kettlebell training for symptomatic knee osteoarthritis. As we've seen from the qualitative study, or actually I haven't been into detail, but as if you read the paper, you will see all of the participants with knee OA reported improvements in their function. I had tried to get a trial of sorts off the ground in my practice, but unfortunately wasn't able to do that. And I would love to have written up a case study specifically on the participants with knee OA and how it improved their symptoms and function. And the same applies to non-specific low back pain. We know how challenging back pain and knee OA are, and there are several programs available for both of those, but it would have been really good had I been able to do those. Unfortunately, I wasn't. And one other, a participant that signed up in the early days, I remember her saying to me, "I hate exercise," and she signed up for the study, and she's still training now and still engaged in those weekly group meetings 2 years after we finished. So that was, for me, a fantastic outcome. We've got an older adult that says, "I hate exercise, but I'm prepared to give it a go," does really well, and then continues to do it. So a really great illustration of behavior change and how it can turn somebody's perception of exercise around quite dramatically. And funnily enough, her health has improved quite considerably in terms of body weight as well. I've included this particular article as it was posted to Twitter by Geronimo Bejarano as evidence that the interventions we have thus far used intended to change people's behaviour as it relates to physical activity and exercise. Whilst there have been improvements in quality of life and function and depressive symptoms, they've had little or no effect on behaviour change in the long term. And that was a sentiment echoed by Derek Griffin, also on Twitter, who said there's no evidence that supervised exercise sessions translate into long-term behaviour change. And I'd responded to that, just highlighting that the participants in the Bell trial, or some of them, are still training now, 2 years after the intervention finished. And here is a picture of that group still training. This was several weeks ago now when I was compiling these slides, but there's a photo of me with that group. And on the right here is a screenshot of an update in the Facebook group chat. Now, whilst the group only gets together on a weekly basis, they're generally corresponding and training together most days of the week. And I'm just going to read through what this lady was doing whilst watching Antiques Roadshow. And that's something that I'd encourage them to do, was while they had a bell in their hand, they can do some exercise watching TV, and that's what I'm doing myself most evenings, well, all evenings at the moment as well. So she's doing deadlifts with a 12-kilo bell, some form of lifts, a front raise of some sort. That wasn't something that we'd done in the trial. She's done 150 swings with a 12-kilo bell, which is pretty impressive. More presses with 8 kilos. And the last time I trained in the park with this lady, she was comfortably pressing 12, which is very impressive. A 2.5-minute plank. Press-ups, or a Pilates press-up, whatever that is, but who cares? And at the end she says, "Now I feel I've kept my commitment to myself, and that is the only thing that matters." So I feel that this is fairly convincing evidence that as a result of the Bell trial, for a number of people, this has significantly changed their behaviour as it relates to exercise and activity. And here's another picture that was sent to me from the ladies when they were training in the park. I won't name names, but I'm just going to talk you through what we're looking at in terms of what I've been talking about over the last however long it's been. In this picture, we're looking at the lady who had osteoporosis, so Sally, as her name was. We're looking at one of the ladies who had an intercostal sprain and still continued training anyway. We're looking at the lady that ripped the apple in half and is training like an absolute animal at the moment. The lady who, to no end, surprised me. She turned up on one occasion and had done 200 goblet squats into a chair non-stop with an 8-kilo bell, which I hadn't asked her to do. She just kept going. And she did 140 step-ups from that video holding an 8-kilo bell, and then subsequently struggled with DOMS. And we're looking at the lady who also said that she hated exercise. So in conclusion, a very tongue-in-cheek way of wrapping up what's been a very long video is the kettlebell training worked. The Bell trial worked, it was effective, and they enjoyed it. Now, to be a little bit more serious, there was a large clinically significant increase in grip strength, if we're going to be reporting it as the primary outcome. There was a very high rate of engagement, both in the classes and with home exercise. There were no serious adverse events, and bearing in mind that I was pushing them very, very hard. And based on all of that, we would recommend that kettlebell training be used to promote healthy aging. And I'm just going to highlight the conclusion from the qualitative study to answer that question: is there sufficient evidence? So the findings of this study provide evidence to support a recommendation that group kettlebell training initiatives delivered by appropriately trained individuals may be used to promote healthy aging in the community. And I don't think I could have been any clearer with that. Now, throughout the different papers, given that they have a different focus, there have been a number of recommendations, and I'm just going to highlight the top ones. So it wasn't all easy going. There are a number of physical challenges that older adults may be facing, and evidently there was quite a range of physical capacity within the group. I approached it very generically, and it was a larger group than was ideal. And there were people in the group that found it more challenging because of limitations and for other reasons. And I think there's definitely opportunity for us to explore how best to use kettlebells with different groups of older adults that have different and very specific functional needs or limited physical capacity. I think there's definitely value in looking further at what made the trial successful. Evidently, it's been successful both in terms of the primary outcome and the effect size of that, and the overwhelming positive response. But in order to be successful and implemented in the community and making a difference on a much bigger scale outside of a clinical trial, we need to have a better understanding of what made it successful and the individual and system barriers that might prevent us from rolling it out more or using it more widely. Everything from training through to funding. In terms of the bone mineral density, that's for me a significant finding. There are limitations, even though we have looked at the causal links associated with that, the Hills criteria, and suggested that there is good evidence that the kettlebell training improved bone mineral density. For osteoporosis, which is a significant challenge for a lot of older adults, there seems to be very strong evidence that more research is required in that area in particular. And as I've also touched on, the arthritis, the low back pain, and the number of other conditions that the older adults reported, and I've gone into in a lot more detail in the qualitative study, there were reports of improvements, and it doesn't necessarily need to be limited to older adults. There are conditions prevalent in younger people, such as unstable or painful shoulders in athletic populations, for whom kettlebell training might also be useful. So I think there's lots of opportunities for further research in MSK conditions. And a better understanding of risks. There's always a risk with some form of exercise. There are increased and different risks associated with an older population, and at this point we have almost no data regarding potential risks of injury. So that's certainly an area worth exploring in a lot more detail. Toward the end of last year, I had a look at the international exercise recommendations in older adults, the expert consensus guidelines, and took some very specific comments and recommendations out of there and linked them with the kettlebell training studies and created a series of posts for Instagram and Facebook. So what I've done on the next dozen slides is literally copy those straight onto the slide, and I'm going to give you 10 seconds or so per slide. You may need to pause it if you need longer than that, to just read through these comments as they relate to kettlebell training, and I will see you in a moment. Obviously, there's considerable bias in those previous slides and a large chunk of artistic license. However, I feel that there are strong links between the kettlebell project or the kettlebell trial and those consensus recommendations for older adults regarding exercise. So if you feel that they might be useful in helping engage with and promote exercise and kettlebell training wherever you are, feel free to jump over to the Instagram page and steal them. So before I say goodbye, I'm just going to leave you with this final thought, and this is specifically aimed at any students that might be currently engaged in a PhD at the moment. It was something that I had seen and read online that had been shared by a recent graduate that had been told to him by a supervisor. And the comment from the supervisor was this: the most valuable output from your PhD is not the thesis, it's you. So if you've got this far, thank you very much, and well done. This has turned into something far, far larger than I had anticipated when I put these together, and obviously this is well beyond what I'm going to be talking about with the students at UQ. I hope it has been useful. I hope it has in some way helped you understand what was involved with the Bell trial and given you something to work with if indeed you're going to be trying to implement a similar program at your own establishment or within your own community. Once again, thank you very much. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me directly. Thank you. Bye-bye.